The stench was overwhelming. Officer Rolf Mueller of the Milwaukee Police Department had encountered many unpleasant odors during his years on the force, but nothing had prepared him for what assaulted his senses as he stepped into apartment 213 at the Oxford Apartments on July 22, 1991. The smell of death and decay hung thick in the air, mixed with chemical odors that seemed to burn the nostrils. What had begun as a routine domestic disturbance call was about to uncover one of the most horrific crime scenes in American history. Konarak Synthesamphone, a 14-year-old Laotian boy, had been found wandering naked and incoherent on the streets of Milwaukee's predominantly African-American neighborhood near 25th and State. Concerned citizens had called police, reporting that the disoriented teenager appeared to be injured and was being pursued by a blond man who claimed to be his boyfriend. That man was Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer, a 31-year-old chocolate factory worker who lived in the Oxford Apartments and had convinced responding officers that the situation was merely a domestic dispute between adult lovers. The tragedy of that night was that the police had initially believed Dahmer's explanation. Despite the pleas of concerned citizens who insisted the boy was clearly underage and in distress, officers had returned Konarak to Dahmer's apartment. The boy's limited English and Dahmer's calm, articulate demeanor had worked in the killer's favor. Within hours of being returned to apartment 213, Konarak would be dead, becoming Dahmer's 15th victim in a killing spree that had begun 13 years earlier. But on this sweltering July evening, as two other officers responded to reports of a foul odor and a strange man acting suspiciously, the truth about Jeffrey Dahmer was finally about to emerge. Tracy Edwards, a 32-year-old African-American man, had escaped from Dahmer's apartment with handcuffs still dangling from his wrist, claiming that a weird dude had tried to kill him. Edwards had led police back to the Oxford Apartments, insisting that the man who had attempted to murder him lived in Unit 213. When officers knocked on the door, they were greeted by a seemingly ordinary man who appeared calm and cooperative. Jeffrey Dahmer was tall and thin, with blonde hair and wire-rimmed glasses that gave him an almost scholarly appearance. He spoke softly and politely, apologizing for any inconvenience and offering to retrieve the key to remove Edwards' handcuffs. There was nothing in his demeanor that suggested he was anything other than a quiet, perhaps eccentric neighbor who had gotten into a minor dispute with an acquaintance. Everything changed when Officer Mueller opened the refrigerator door. The discovery of a severed human head, eyes staring sightlessly from between containers of food and condiments, marked the moment when Jeffrey Dahmer's carefully constructed facade finally collapsed. Within hours, investigators would uncover evidence of crimes so depraved and horrific that they would challenge society's understanding of human evil. The apartment contained the remains of 11 victims, preserved in various states of decomposition, dissolution, and grotesque transformation. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer had been born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer. On the surface, his early childhood appeared unremarkable. He was the first child of educated middle-class parents who seemed to provide a stable, nurturing environment. His father, Lionel, was a chemist who would later pursue a career as an analytical chemist, while his mother, Joyce, worked as a teletype machine instructor. The family lived in a comfortable home in the suburbs, and young Jeffrey appeared to be a normal, healthy child. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy, disturbing patterns were already beginning to emerge. Jeffrey displayed an unusual fascination with dead animals from an early age, collecting roadkill and performing crude experiments on the carcasses. He would later describe feeling compelled to cut open dead animals to see what was inside, behavior that his father initially encouraged as scientific curiosity. Lionel, perhaps projecting his own interest in chemistry and biology onto his son, even showed Jeffrey how to clean and preserve animal bones using acid. The family dynamics were complicated by Joyce Dahmer's struggles with mental health issues and prescription drug dependency. She suffered from depression and anxiety, often spending days in bed and leaving much of Jeffrey's care to his father or babysitters. The household was frequently tense, with arguments between his parents becoming increasingly common as Joyce's condition worsened. When Jeffrey was 4 years old, his brother David was born, but rather than bringing the family together, the new addition seemed to increase the stress and dysfunction. Jeffrey's social development was problematic from the start. He was an intelligent child but struggled to form meaningful relationships with peers. Teachers and family members noted that he seemed increasingly withdrawn and isolated as he grew older. He showed little interest in typical childhood activities or friendships, preferring to spend time alone, engaged in solitary pursuits that often involved dead animals or macabre fantasies. By adolescence, Jeffrey's behavior had become increasingly troubling. He had developed a drinking problem, often consuming alcohol before school and maintaining a secret stash of liquor in his bedroom. His academic performance, while still adequate, began to decline as he became more withdrawn and antisocial. His parents, dealing with their own marital problems and Joyce's continued mental health struggles, seemed unable or unwilling to address their son's obvious psychological issues. The first clear sign that Jeffrey's problems extended beyond typical teenage rebellion came during his senior year of high school. Classmates would later recall that he seemed fascinated by death and often made disturbing comments about violence and corpses. He had begun having elaborate fantasies about killing and controlling other people, particularly young men who fit a specific physical type that attracted him. These fantasies were becoming increasingly detailed and compelling, and Jeffrey was beginning to plan how he might make them reality. On June 18, 1978, just 3 weeks after graduating from Revere High School in Bath Township, Ohio, Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. The victim was Stephen Mark Hicks, an 18-year-old hitchhiker who had been picked up by Dahmer while attempting to travel to a rock concert. Dahmer had convinced Hicks to come to his family's home, where they drank beer and talked for several hours. When Hicks attempted to leave, Dahmer struck him in the head with a barbell, killing him instantly. The murder of Stephen Hicks marked the beginning of a 13-year killing spree that would claim at least 17 lives. After killing Hicks, Dahmer dismembered the body in his family's basement, dissolving the flesh with acid and scattering the bones in the woods behind the house. The methodical way he disposed of the remains revealed a level of planning and forethought that suggested this was not a crime of passion, but the first expression of long-developing homicidal urges. Following the Hicks murder, Dahmer's life seemed to stabilize temporarily. He enrolled at Ohio State University, but lasted only 1 semester before dropping out due to poor academic performance and excessive drinking. His father, hoping to instill discipline and direction in his troubled son, convinced Jeffrey to enlist in the U.S. Army in December 1978. Dahmer was assigned to Baumholder, West Germany, where he served as a combat medic. The military experience provided structure and routine that seemed to help Dahmer control his violent impulses for several years. However, his drinking problem continued and eventually worsened, leading to disciplinary problems and a general discharge in 1981. Fellow soldiers would later describe Dahmer as quiet and competent in his duties, but increasingly isolated and prone to heavy drinking. Some recalled that he seemed to have an unusual interest in medical procedures and anatomy, which they attributed to his training as a medic. After his discharge from the Army, Dahmer returned to Ohio and briefly lived with his father and stepmother before moving to Milwaukee to live with his grandmother, Catherine Dahmer. This period, from 1981 to 1988, represented a relative calm in Dahmer's criminal activity. He held various jobs, including a stint at a blood plasma center and later at the Ambrosia Chocolate Company, where he would work for 6 years. To outward appearances, he seemed to be making an effort to lead a normal, productive life. However, beneath this facade of normalcy, Dahmer's psychological state was deteriorating. He was struggling with his homosexuality in an era when being gay carried significant social stigma, particularly in the conservative Midwest. His attempts at normal relationships were unsuccessful, and he found himself increasingly drawn to gay bars and bathhouses in Milwaukee's small but active gay community. His drinking continued to be problematic, and he was arrested several times for public intoxication and disorderly conduct. More troubling was Dahmer's escalating pattern of predatory behavior. He began frequenting areas where vulnerable young men could be found: gay bars, bus stations, shopping malls, looking for potential victims. His method was always the same. He would approach attractive young men, usually minorities or those who appeared to be struggling financially, and offer them money to pose for photographs or to accompany him home for drinks. His victims were often homeless, recently arrived in the city, or otherwise disconnected from family and support systems that might quickly notice their disappearance. The psychological profile that emerged from later analysis revealed a complex individual driven by a combination of sexual sadism, necrophilia, and an overwhelming need for control. Dahmer was not motivated by hatred or anger in the traditional sense, but rather by a desire to possess his victims completely and permanently. He wanted to create willing, compliant partners who would never leave him, and when this proved impossible with living victims, he turned to death as a means of achieving the total control he craved. By 1987, Dahmer's urges had become uncontrollable, and he began killing again. His second victim was Stephen Tuomi, a 25-year-old man whom Dahmer met at a gay bar and took to a hotel room. Dahmer later claimed that he had no memory of killing Tuomi, saying he had awakened to find the man dead beside him with bruises around his neck. Whether this was true or simply another of Dahmer's many lies and manipulations, the death of Stephen Tuomi marked the beginning of the most intensive period of his killing spree. Between 1987 and 1991, Dahmer would kill 15 more victims, developing increasingly elaborate rituals around the murders and the disposal of bodies. He experimented with different methods of killing, different ways of preserving and manipulating the corpses, and different chemicals for dissolving flesh and bone. His apartment became a grotesque laboratory where he pursued his fantasies of control and possession with scientific precision and methodical planning. The investigation that followed Dahmer's arrest revealed the full scope of his crimes and the failure of multiple systems to stop him earlier. There had been numerous warning signs and missed opportunities for intervention. In 1988, he had been arrested for drugging and sexually assaulting a 13-year-old Laotian boy, the older brother of Konarak Sinthasomphone, who would become one of Dahmer's final victims 3 years later. Despite the serious nature of these charges, Dahmer had been sentenced to only 1 year in prison and 5 years of probation. Even more troubling was the response to the Konarak Sinthasomphone incident on the night before Dahmer's arrest. When concerned citizens called police about the naked, injured boy, officers had treated it as a domestic dispute rather than a potential crime. Despite the obvious signs that Sinthasomphone was underage and in distress, despite the strong chemical odors coming from Dahmer's apartment, despite the pleas of witnesses who insisted something was wrong, police had returned the boy to his killer. The failures were not limited to law enforcement. Dahmer's neighbors had complained repeatedly about terrible odors coming from his apartment, sounds of drilling and sawing at odd hours, and his strange behavior. Building management had received numerous complaints, but had taken little action beyond occasional warnings to Dahmer about noise. Social workers and probation officers who were supposed to be monitoring Dahmer during his probation had missed or ignored obvious signs that he was not complying with the terms of his sentence. Perhaps most tragically, many of Dahmer's victims had been vulnerable individuals who had fallen through the cracks of society's safety net. Many were young men of color, immigrants, or members of other marginalized communities whose disappearances were not immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. The systemic racism and homophobia of the era meant that when these men went missing, their cases often received minimal attention from authorities and media. As the investigation progressed, the true scope of Dahmer's depravity became clear. Beyond the murders themselves, he had engaged in necrophilia, cannibalism, and the preservation of body parts as trophies. He had attempted to create zombies by drilling holes in victims' skulls and injecting acid or boiling water into their brains, hoping to create compliant, mindless partners. He had photographed his victims in various stages of death and dismemberment, creating a grotesque record of his crimes. The physical evidence found in Dahmer's apartment painted a picture of methodical, systematic killing that had been refined over years of practice. Investigators found skulls and bones that had been cleaned and preserved, photographs documenting the entire process of murder and dismemberment, and chemical supplies used for dissolving bodies. The refrigerator and freezer contained human remains that Dahmer claimed to have been consuming, while other body parts were found stored in acid-filled containers throughout the apartment. The discovery of Dahmer's crimes sent shockwaves through Milwaukee and the nation. The case challenged assumptions about the nature of evil and the ability of seemingly normal individuals to commit acts of unprecedented depravity. It raised troubling questions about the failures of law enforcement, social services, and community oversight that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long. Most painfully, it highlighted the vulnerability of marginalized communities and the deadly consequences of societal indifference to their welfare. The arrest of Jeffrey Dahmer marked the end of one of the most horrific killing sprees in American history, but it was only the beginning of a legal and social reckoning that would force the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about violence, mental illness, racism, and the limits of human understanding. The man who had seemed so ordinary, so unremarkable to his neighbors and co-workers, had been revealed as a monster whose crimes defied comprehension and whose story would haunt the American consciousness for generations to come. The investigation into Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes quickly became one of the most intensive and disturbing criminal inquiries in American history. As detectives processed the horrific crime scene at apartment 213, the scope of Dahmer's depravity became increasingly clear. What they found went far beyond simple murder. It was evidence of a systematic campaign of torture, sexual assault, murder, dismemberment, necrophilia, and cannibalism that had been refined and perfected over more than a decade. Detective Patrick Kennedy, one of the lead investigators on the case, would later describe the apartment as the most disturbing crime scene he had encountered in 20 years of police work. The refrigerator contained a severed head, hands, and genitals stored alongside ordinary food items. The freezer held more body parts, including a torso that had been meticulously cleaned and prepared. Throughout the apartment, investigators found skulls that had been painted and preserved as trophies, photographs documenting the entire process of murder and dismemberment, and containers filled with acid and human remains in various stages of decomposition. Perhaps most chilling was the evidence of Dahmer's attempts to create what he called zombies, living victims who would be completely under his control. Investigators found a power drill and bottles of hydrochloric acid that Dahmer had used to inject into the skulls of living victims, hoping to destroy enough brain tissue to render them compliant but not dead. These experiments had been largely unsuccessful, typically resulting in the victims' deaths within hours or days, but they revealed the depth of Dahmer's desire for absolute control over other human beings. The methodical nature of Dahmer's crimes was evident in every aspect of the crime scene. He had developed elaborate rituals around the killing and disposal of bodies, photographing each stage of the process and keeping detailed records of his activities. His victims had been posed in specific positions for photographs, their bodies manipulated and arranged according to Dahmer's twisted fantasies. The preservation and storage of body parts followed careful procedures that Dahmer had refined through experimentation and practice. As news of the arrest spread, the investigation expanded to include other jurisdictions where Dahmer had lived and worked. Authorities in Ohio reopened the Stephen Hicks case from 1978, using information provided by Dahmer to locate remains that had been scattered in the woods behind his family home. Military investigators examined Dahmer's service record and interviewed former colleagues who recalled his strange behavior and fascination with medical procedures during his time in Germany. The task of identifying Dahmer's victims proved challenging, as many of the remains were fragmentary and in various stages of decomposition. Forensic anthropologists and odontologists worked to match dental records, DNA samples, and personal effects with missing person reports from across the Midwest. The process was complicated by the fact that many of Dahmer's victims had been transient individuals whose disappearances had not been immediately reported or thoroughly investigated. As victims were identified, their stories began to emerge, painting a heartbreaking picture of vulnerable young men who had fallen prey to a predator who specifically targeted those society was least likely to protect. Many were young men of color from troubled backgrounds who had come to Milwaukee seeking opportunities or fleeing difficult situations at home. Others were immigrants or individuals struggling with addiction, homelessness, or their own sexual identity in an era when being gay carried significant social stigma. The families of Dahmer's victims faced the additional trauma of learning not only that their loved ones had been murdered, but that they had been subjected to unspeakable indignities after death. The knowledge that Dahmer had consumed parts of their family members, kept their remains as trophies, and photographed their degradation added layers of horror to an already unbearable loss. Many families struggled with whether to pursue civil litigation or simply try to move forward with their grief. The investigation also revealed a pattern of missed opportunities and systemic failures that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long. The 1988 sexual assault case involving Konark Sinthasomphon's older brother had resulted in minimal punishment despite clear evidence of Dahmer's predatory behavior toward children. The sentence of 1 year in prison and 5 years of probation was widely criticized as inadequate, particularly given that Dahmer had served only 10 months before being released. Even more troubling was the response to numerous complaints from Dahmer's neighbors about strange odors, sounds, and behavior coming from apartment 213. Residents of the Oxford apartments had repeatedly contacted building management and police about the terrible smells emanating from Dahmer's unit. The sounds of drilling and sawing at all hours, and Dahmer's odd behavior around the building. In one instance, a neighbor had actually confronted Dahmer about the smell, only to be told that his freezer had broken down and spoiled meat was rotting inside. The failure to properly investigate these complaints was attributed to a combination of factors, including inadequate resources for non-emergency police calls, the low priority given to quality-of-life complaints in high-crime neighborhoods, and possible bias against the concerns of residents in a predominantly minority community. Critics argued that if similar complaints had been made in a wealthier, whiter neighborhood, they would have received more serious attention from authorities. The most devastating failure, however, was the police response to the Konark Sinthasomphone incident on May 27, 1991. When concerned citizens called 911 about a naked, injured teenager being pursued by an adult man, the responding officers had treated it as a domestic dispute rather than a potential crime. Despite clear evidence that Sinthasomphone was underage, injured, and in distress, despite the strong chemical odors coming from Dahmer's apartment, and despite the insistence of witnesses that something was seriously wrong, officers had returned the boy to his killer. Audio recordings of the 911 calls from that night revealed the frustration of witnesses who tried to convince police that the boy was clearly a minor in need of help. The callers described Sinthasomphone as appearing drugged or injured, bleeding from his rectum, and unable to communicate effectively in English. They expressed concern about the man who was claiming to be the boy's boyfriend, noting that he seemed agitated and was trying to force the boy to come with him. The police response was characterized by a casual attitude that critics attributed to homophobia and racism. The officers who responded seemed more concerned with avoiding involvement in what they perceived as a gay domestic dispute than with properly assessing the safety of a clearly vulnerable individual. Their report characterized Synthesamphone as an adult who was intoxicated and involved in a lover's quarrel, despite obvious evidence to the contrary. When officers escorted Dahmer and Synthesamphone back to apartment 213, they failed to conduct even a cursory investigation of the premises. Had they looked around the apartment or investigated the source of the terrible smell that was immediately apparent upon entering, they would have discovered evidence of Dahmer's crimes and potentially saved not only Synthesamphone's life, but the lives of several subsequent victims. Instead, they accepted Dahmer's explanation and left, sealing the boy's fate. The public revelation of these failures led to widespread criticism of the Milwaukee Police Department and calls for reform in how missing person cases and domestic disputes were handled. The officers involved in the Synthesamphone incident faced disciplinary action, though many critics argued that the consequences were insufficient given the gravity of their failure. The case became a catalyst for discussions about police training, community relations, and the need for more sensitive handling of cases involving vulnerable populations. As the investigation continued, psychologists and criminologists began attempting to understand the mind of Jeffrey Dahmer and the factors that had created such a prolific and depraved killer. Interviews with family members, former teachers, and childhood friends revealed a pattern of disturbing behavior that had begun at an early age, but had been either ignored or misinterpreted by those around him. The role of Dahmer's family background in his development as a killer became a subject of intense scrutiny and debate. His parents' troubled marriage, his mother's mental health issues and prescription drug abuse, and the general dysfunction of his household were all examined as potential contributing factors. However, experts cautioned against simple explanations, noting that many individuals experience similar childhood trauma without becoming violent criminals. More significant seemed to be Dahmer's early fascination with death and violence, combined with his social isolation and inability to form normal relationships. His childhood experiments with dead animals, his elaborate fantasies about control and domination, and his escalating substance abuse problems had created a dangerous psychological profile that should have been recognized and addressed long before he committed his first murder. The investigation also examined the role of mental illness in Dahmer's crimes. While he was clearly suffering from severe psychological disorders, the question of whether he was legally insane, unable to distinguish right from wrong, would become central to his eventual trial. The careful planning and methodical nature of his crimes suggested that he understood the illegality and immorality of his actions, even as he was compelled to continue committing them. As the full scope of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes became public, the case sparked a national conversation about the nature of evil, the failures of mental health and criminal justice systems, and society's responsibility to protect its most vulnerable members. The investigation had revealed not just the actions of a single depraved individual, but the systemic failures that had allowed him to continue killing for more than a decade, while living and working among ordinary people who never suspected the monster in their midst. The discovery of Jeffrey Dahmer's crimes revealed a complex web of psychological, social, and criminal factors that had allowed one of America's most notorious serial killers to operate undetected for over a decade. As investigators delved deeper into Dahmer's background and methods, disturbing patterns emerged that shed light on both his psychological development and the systemic failures that had enabled his killing spree. The psychological profile that emerged from extensive interviews and analysis painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual whose pathology had developed over many years. Dr. George Palermo, a forensic psychiatrist who examined Dahmer extensively, identified a complex array of mental disorders, including borderline personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, and psychotic disorder. However, the central driving force behind Dahmer's crimes appeared to be his overwhelming need for control and possession of other human beings. Dahmer's own explanations of his motivations, given during lengthy interviews with FBI behavioral analysts and psychiatrists, revealed the twisted logic that had driven his crimes. He described feeling powerless and abandoned throughout his life, beginning with his parents' troubled marriage and continuing through his struggles with his sexual identity and social isolation. The murders, he claimed, were attempts to create the perfect companion who would never leave him, first through killing, then through his attempts to create zombies, and finally through preserving body parts and consuming his victims. The sexual component of Dahmer's crimes was particularly complex, involving elements of homosexuality, necrophilia, and cannibalism that challenged conventional understanding of sexual deviance. His victims were all young men who fit a specific physical type, typically slender, attractive men in their late teens or early 20s, often minorities or individuals who appeared vulnerable. The sexual assault and mutilation of victims, both before and after death, suggested that Dahmer's crimes were primarily sexually motivated, though the exact nature of his sexual pathology remained difficult to categorize. The cannibalistic aspects of Dahmer's crimes were perhaps the most difficult for investigators and the public to comprehend. Dahmer claimed that consuming parts of his victims was another way of making them permanently part of himself, ensuring they could never leave him. He described preparing and eating various body parts, often saving choice portions in his refrigerator for later consumption. This behavior placed him among a very small category of serial killers who engage in anthropophagy, adding another layer of horror to crimes that were already almost incomprehensible. The methodical nature of Dahmer's crimes suggested a level of planning and organization that contradicted initial assumptions about his mental state. His careful selection of victims, his elaborate methods of luring them to his apartment, and his systematic approach to murder and body disposal all indicated a functioning, if deeply disturbed individual who was capable of sustained criminal planning. This organized behavior would later become crucial in legal proceedings, as it suggested that Dahmer understood the illegality of his actions and took steps to avoid detection.